Tarsila do Amaral, known in Brazil simply as Tarsila, is considered to be the Brazilian painter who best achieved Brazilian aspirations for nationalistic expression in a modern style. Tarsila was born in 1886 in Capivari, São Paulo, to a family of relatively wealthy landowners who grew coffee. In her teenage years, the family traveled to Spain, where in Barcelona Tarsila attended a Catholic school and developed her interest in art by copying pieces in the school's collection. In 1906, she entered an arranged marriage with André Teixeira Pinto, a distant cousin. They had a daughter together, Dulce. The marriage did not last long. After separating from her husband, Tarsila enrolled in art classes in São Paulo in 1916. While there, she studied with well-known artists such as Pedro Alexandrino. In 1820, she and Dulce moved to Paris, where she enrolled in the Julian Academy and studied under Émile Renard. Tarsila and Dulce traveled throughout Europe during this period. In 1922, Tarsila was one of 3 Brazilians and the only female to have a painting admitted to the Salon, a prestigious honor. Later that year, they returned to São Paulo. Tarsila was exposed to modernism through the painter Anita Malfatti and the poet-writers Oswald Giandraghi, Mario Giandraghi, of no relation to Oswald, and Menotti del Picchia. Prior to her arrival, in February of that year, they, along with other artists, had organized the Semana de Arte Moderna, or Week of Modern Art. This movement sought to challenge the conservative artistic culture in Brazil and encourage modern styles and forms. Tarsila was asked to join, and they became known as the Grupo de Cinco, or Group of Five. This group aimed to promote Brazil and Brazilian styles in place of European. This involved the inclusion of indigenous motifs, previously excluded as being of a lower artistic class. In 1923, Tarsila returned briefly to Paris, accompanied by Oswald. There, she was exposed to different veins of modernism, including Cubism, Futurism, and Expressionism, while she studied under artists such as André Lotte, Fernand Léger, and Albert Glaise. During this period, Tarsila discovered the somewhat newfound interest Europe had developed in primitivism. This led her to increase her use of indigenous Brazilian motifs and forms in her artwork, while integrating modern stylistic trends. In a letter to her family, Tarsila wrote, "I feel myself ever more Brazilian. I want to be a painter of my country. Don't think that this Brazilian trend is looked down upon here. On the contrary, what they want here is that each one bring a contribution from his own country. Paris is fed up with Parisian art." While in Paris, Tarsila painted A Negra, or the Black Woman. It displays both indigenous theme and modern technique in the depiction of a highly stylized black woman, with distorted features and a large breast which hangs over one leg. This figure may refer to the common practice in Brazil of using black wet nurses, and thus symbolically represent the nourishment of the country. Tarsila and Oswald traveled throughout Europe before returning to Brazil at the end of 1923. Back in Brazil, they began to travel the countryside, searching for artistic inspiration. They explored indigenous culture while researching Brazil's history, traveling throughout Rio de Janeiro and Minas Gerais. Tarsila produced numerous drawings during this period, many of them illustrations for the poetry written by Oswald and Blaise Cendrars, a Swiss poet who accompanied them for much of their travels in Brazil. Tarsila wrote that she rediscovered in Minas the colors I loved when I was a child, the caipira, or rural, colors. From this point, color became one of the strongest aspects of Tarsila's artwork. In 1924, Oswald wrote the Manifesto de Poesia para o Brasil, or Pau-Brazilian Poetry Manifesto. He claimed that Brazilian culture was a product of the importation of European culture. He wrote that, like the wood of the pau-brasil tree from which Brazil draws its name, artists must export Brazilian culture by creating uniquely Brazilian works. One of Tarsila's most famous paintings from this period, known as her pau-brasil phase, is Estrada de Ferro Central do Brasil, or Central Brazilian Railway. The flattened forms depict the duality of pre- and postmodern Brazil. Brazilian vegetation and a colonial church coexist with stark industrialism, evidenced by the thick black lines illustrating modern technology, for example, the railroad. Her style in this painting may be considered post-cubist in its simplification of forms. The 1924 paintings, Carnaval in Madureira, Caipirinha, and Morro da Favela, are also included in the pau-brasil phase, as is her mid-1920s painting of an angler. In 1926, Tarsila and Oswald were married. They continued to travel in Europe as well as the Middle East. Tarsila's first solo exhibition was held in Paris at the Galerie Percier, for which she received much critical acclaim, especially due to her use of bright colors and tropical forms. In 1928, Tarsila gave her husband an untitled painting for his birthday. Oswald dubbed the piece Abaporu, a Tupi-Guarani Indian word meaning man who eats. He used the piece as the cover for his Manifesto Antropófago. This cannibalist manifesto called on Brazilians to devour European styles and influences. According to Oswald, this would allow Brazilians to create their own style and culture, free from European constraints. Avaporu features a disproportionate figure with a large leg and foot in the painting's immediate foreground. The painting is also marked by a highly stylized lemon slice sun and a cactus, both representative of Brazil, both of which became hallmarks of Tarsila's style. The anthropophagite movement celebrated Brazil as the country of the big snake, and Tarsila's Urutu, painted in 1928, features a large egg along with a snake native to Brazil, for which Urutu is the Tupi-Guarani word. This painting can be considered a statement of Brazil's native fruitfulness, with the snake and egg transformed respectively into male and female fertility symbols. The following year, with the anthropophagite movement in full swing, Tarsila painted Anthropophagia. This painting, translated as cannibalism, features entwined figures reminiscent to A Negra and Abaporu. Also included are the signature lemon slice sun, a cactus, and a Brazilian banana leaf, another of Tarsila's common inclusions. It was also during 1929 that Tarsila had her first solo exhibition in Brazil, at the Palace Hotel in Rio de Janeiro. Later that year, she had another at the Salão Glória in São Paulo. One example of her work during this period is the 1929 Sol Poente, or Setting Sun, which features a group of abstract otters swimming at sunset. In 1930, Tarsila's work was featured in exhibitions in New York and Paris. That year also saw the dissolution of her marriage to Oswald de Andrade. Composition is an abstract piece from that year, featuring a much darker color scheme than usual, evidence of her depression over the divorce. In 1931, Tarsila traveled to the Soviet Union, where her work was exhibited in Moscow. She was deeply influenced by the conditions in which the Russian people were living, as evidenced in the 1933 painting Segunda Classe, or second-class carriage. After Tarsila's return to Brazil in 1932, in the midst of the São Paulo constitutional revolt against Brazilian dictator Getúlio Vargas, she was jailed briefly after being accused of having communist sympathies. Tarsila's Neo-Pau-Brasil phase began in 1933. Tarsila would focus on Brazilian themes for the rest of her life. She finally settled in São Paulo in 1938 after years of traveling between there and Rio de Janeiro. She lived there, painting Brazilian people and landscapes until her death in 1973.